Hello friends, welcome back to this series where Jim tinkers with the mechanics of starter kit number 4 that covers the Pacific theater of operations in the advanced squad leader game. We are entering the Japanese rally phase of the third round, where the Nippon forces are about to drop the dreaded Banzai charge on the Americans. The Banzai charge allows Japanese units involved in this type of attack to head towards enemy units with several advantages. The morale of units involved in the Banzai attack is increased by 1 point. These units are immune to pin or heat of battle and also gain a total of 8 movement factors. The units involved in Banzai only cease their activity if they enter the hex on which the charge was directed. If the units enter hex with an enemy unit with the end of the 8 movement factors or have their morale broken or are eliminated by fire of the enemy. But before we get there, let's start with the rally phase of the Japanese phase. The Japanese try to recover the function of the light machine gun in D4, which in addition to not recovering the function, they have this machine gun eliminated due to the result of 6 on the dice roll. No more Japanese activity, and the Americans will try to recover the morale of the gun crew who are stacking up with the 9-2 leader. The modifiers will be -1 for the jungle and -2 for the leader, and this unit will have its morale restored if the dice result is less than or equal to 11. Three minus 3 equals 0, and the unit regains its morale. The American squadron in G3 will attempt to equip the cannon, requiring a 5 or less dice result. 5 and the squad takes control of the cannon. Prep fire phase, and the Japanese choose not to shoot, retaining their potential to be used in the Banzai charge. Movement phase. And finally, we come to the long-awaited moment of this match, which will be the launch of the Banzai attack. During this attack, Japanese units move towards the hex target through so-called impulse. The impulse ends when all units involved in the Banzai move 1 hex, using in this impulse the number of movement factors equivalent to the highest spent movement factor. This may not seem clear at the moment, but during an action itself we will be able to appreciate this dynamic in greater detail. The units involved must move towards the objective hex, in the sense of always being closer and closer to this objective hex. For the Banzai attack to be launched, we need at least one of the units involved to have a line of sight on the target hex unit, and that this unit is 8 hexes or less from the enemy unit. The presence of at least one leader is necessary. For this charge, Japanese units in hexes F8, G9, H9 will be used. Jim chooses not to use the units in the I9 hex, as his movement towards the Banzai target, which will be the hex occupied by the anti-aircraft gun in G3, will cost 4 movement factors in the first impulse. This unit moves to the American rear at J7. The central axis of this charge will be the units with the leader 9-1 in G9, whose final target will be the G3 hex, 6 hexes away. As previously mentioned, these units have an increase of 1 morale point, are immune to pin, can enter enemy hex in the movement phase, with no possibility of ambush. and lose the concealment marker. The axis of this movement will be around line G. Leader 10-1 will not participate in Banzai. First impulse, G9 to G8 using 1 move factor. Units in F8 move to F7 using 2 movement factors due to jungle. And units in H9 move to H8 using 2 movement factors due to moving up 1 level. With this first impulse ends using 2 movement factors of the 8 it is entitled to, and now the Americans can carry out the defensive fire. The Americans use infantry fire equivalent, IFE, from the anti-aircraft gun on the Japanese units in the G8 hex, with 8 firepower, without the help of the leader 10-2. As modifiers we will have -1 for the open terrain of the hex where the Japanese units are located and -1 for not using the assault move. With the result of 4-4, the American unit suffers covering, and the column of 6 firepower will be used in the evaluation of this shot and the cannon loses the rate of fire. 8-2 equals 6, which is 1 morale check. The Japanese leader passes with ease. The second and third squads also pass. The American squadron in this hex fires using the medium machine gun, with 8 firepower directed by leader 10-2, with the modifiers of -1 for non-assault movement, -1 for movement in open terrain and -2 for the American leader. 7-4 equals 3, which is an casualty reduction and 2 morale check, with the machine gun maintaining rate of fire. The first roll of the dice will be for the random selection of the unit that will suffer the casualty reduction. The leader is chosen, and this leader is wounded, and has his quality and modifier reduced. Jim, once again, drops the ball and fails to do a dice roll to assess the severity of the injury. With the result of 8 + 2 equals 10, and first squad suffers a reduction in effective, turning this marker face to that with the strike. With the result of 6 + 2 equals 8, and the second squad passes, as this unit has a morale of 9, 7 + 1 for Banzai, +1 for the presence of a leader in the same hex. Only now does Jim decide to assess the severity of the Japanese leader's injury, and with a result of 4, the leader passes. The Americans fire a new shot, with 6 firepower, -4 modifiers. Double 5 to 10-4 equals 6, which is 1 morale check. There is no covering as the shot is directed by the American leader. The machine gun loses its rate of fire. the Japanese leader passes as his morale is increased by 1 point due to Banzai. The first squad also passes. And the second squadron is reduced in strength and the counter is flipped to the strike phase. There is no more defensive fire and we go for the second impulse. F7 to G7 spending 1 movement factor. G8 to F7 spending 2 movement factors due the jungle, and H8 to H7 spending 2 movement factors, spending a total of 4 movement factors in 2 impulses from 8 to that these units have. Third impulse, H7 to H6 with 2 movement factors, G7 to G6 with 1 movement factor, and F7 to G7 by 1 movement factor, spending 6 movement factors so far. The wounded leader does not follow the stacking because after the wound, he has only 3 movement factors that have already been exhausted. The American stack on I6 shoots the Japanese stack on H6 with 7 firepower, doubled to 14 firepower by being point-blank fire. The modifiers will be -1 for non-assault movement, +2 for dense jungle, -2 for leader -2. The shot will be 12 firepower -1. Four -1 equals 3, which in the 12 firepower column equals a reduction in the effective and 3 morale check, K/3, which Jim considers just a 3 morale check. The first squadron breaks above the ELR, and with the result of 12 they must suffer a casualty reduction and a quality reduction, so we will have the 447 squadron reduced to a second class 347 squadron that takes the phase with the strike. The second squad breaks, and its face is turned to the face with the strike. The Americans choose not to fire any more shots. In the case of the Americans on I6 they will be obliged, in the case of the Japanese units advancing on this hex, to fire a fire shot tripled by the shot originating from the same hex, and if they have already used the subsequent first fire, this fire will be a final protective fire, when the result of this mandatory shot will serve as a morale test for the American units, and if they break, they will enter close combat in very unfavorable conditions, under the DN counter. In the case of the Americans in H5 they choose not to fire to keep the concealment counter, which guarantees the advantage of being attacked by half the enemy's firepower during close combat. Let's go to the fourth impulse. The Japanese units on H6 move into the hex occupied by the American units on I6 using 2 movement factors. Units in G6 move into the hex occupied by Americans in H5 using 2 movement factors. Finally, the stack in G7 moves to G6 at the expense of 1 move factor. With this we end this Banzai attack. with 2 Japanese stacks penetrating hexes occupied by the Americans, and the last squad ceases the Banzai charge for having exhausted the movement factors. Jim will mark the hexes occupied by Americans and Japanese with the close combat counter just to demarcate them, because, technically, they will only start close combat from the advance phase. It is important to note that, in the case of penetration of a hex occupied by enemy units in Banzai charge, an ambush does not occur. The Americans on I-6 will fire a shot at the Japanese units that penetrated the hex with 7 firepower, ALD 3.5 FP, for being subsequent first fire, crippled by the fact that the shot originates from the same hex. Firepower will be 8 firepower, +2 for dense jungle, -1 for non-assault movement, -2 for leader, -2. 8 - 1 = 7, which is 1 morale check. With the result of 8, the first squadron should be pinned. They are no longer under Banzai, as they have the 1-point increase in morale maintained until the end of the Japanese phase, but Jim considered the squadron as being affected and reduced to half squad. The second squad also breaks and becomes a half squad. At this point, Jim checks the rules for starter kit number 4 and discovers that, in the case of Banzai, both units that penetrate the hex and those that occupy the hex lose the concealment counter, and Jim has lost the opportunity to perform a first defensive shot against Japanese units that were in adjacent hex, and will only perform a first defensive fire on Japanese units, crippled by the shot originating from the same hex. This shot will be 10 firepower, crippled to 30. The modifiers are +2 for dense jungle, -1 for non-assault movement. Eight plus 1 = 9, which is a 2 moral check in the 30 firepower column. The first squad takes a reduction and flips to the face with the stripe. And the second squad passes, ending activities related to this Banzai charge. Now let's move on to the second Banzai charge. The units located in hexes F5, E6, D5, and D4 will participate in this maneuver. The target will be the American stack on H3. Let's start the first push with D4 moving to E4 with 1 move factor. D5 to D4 with 2 movement factors. E6 to E5 with 1 movement factor. F5 to G5 with 1 movement factor. With this movement we end the first impulse of this Banzai with the expenditure of 2 movement factors. From now on the Americans will be able to unleash their defensive fire. And they do it with the lone American squad in H4 with 8 firepower -1 for the Japanese open ground, -1 for the non-assault move. 8 minus 2 equals 6, which is 1 morale check. Eight plus 1 equal 9, which is the same morale as the Japanese leader who has his morale increased by 1 due to Banzai. Under usual conditions, when the result of the dices in the morale check equals the morale of the unit, it becomes pinned, which does not occur in Banzai charge, where units are immune to the pin. The other units pass this morale test check. The Americans choose not to direct any shots, and we go for the second impulse. The newly attacked stack penetrates the American hex in H4 with the expenditure of 2 movement factors, ending its participation in this Banzai. The American squad in H4 generating a shot of 5 firepower halved for being a subsequent first fire, tripled to 7.5 firepower, with a shot of 6 firepower, -1 for non-assault movement, +2 for the dense jungle. 9 plus 1 equal 10, which is a miss, and we will move for third impulse. The squad at E4 moves to E3 at the expense of 1 movement factor. The E5 squad moves to F4 at the expense of 1 movement factor. And finally, the squad from D4 to E4 with the expenditure of 1 movement factor, with the expenditure of a total of 4 movement factors so far. The Americans fire an illegal shot with machine gun at H3 on the Japanese squad at F3. This attack is illegal, as the dense jungle is an inherent obstacle to the hex, that is, the edges of the hexes with this type of vegetation are also dense jungle, which is an obstacle to the line of sight that passes through this margin, which is the case here. Either way, the shot will be 4 firepower with the modifiers of -1 for open ground movement, -1 for non-assault movement. Five minus 2 equals 3, which is to moral check. Nine plus 2 equals 11, and this Japanese squad becomes a half squad. Let's go to the third impulse. Units in F4 move to G4 at the expense of 1 movement factor. The half squad in F3 moves to G4 at the expense of 1 movement factor. Units in E4 move to F3 at the expense of 1 movement factor, ending the third impulse at the total expenditure of 5 movement factors. Japanese units in F3 suffer the 2 residual fire attack, -2 modifiers. Five minus 2 equals 3, which is 1 morale check. The first squad breaks above the ELR of the Japanese, and therefore will suffer a reduction in manpower and quality, becoming a second-class 137 half squad. The Huff Squad suffers the third morale break and becomes broken under the DN marker. The two American units in H3 fire a total of 20 firepower on the Japanese in G4 with -2 modifier. Seven -2 equals 5, which is an excellent 4 morale check. The first squad surprisingly passes. The second squad breaks and becomes a Huff Squad. And, in a new stroke of luck, the Huff Squad passes the moral check. Fourth impulse. Units in G4 move and penetrate the hex with American units in F3. The Huff Squad in F3 moves to hex G3 occupied by the Americans. In H3 the Americans do a 12 firepower attack. -1 for the non-assault move and +2 for the dense jungle. 4 + 1 = 5, which is to moral check. 11 + 2 = 13, and the Japanese squad breaks above ELR and will be reduced in quality and effective, becoming a second-rate to 3-7 squad. The Huff Squad breaks above the ELR and finds itself reduced to second class. As it is the third sequential break, it is under the DN marker. The 237 Huff Squad passes the test. Units stacked under the leader 10-2 fires on the Japanese Huff Squad. 12 firepower, -1 for non-assault movement, -2 for leader, +2 for jungle. With the result of 2, the Japanese Huff Squad is eliminated. With that we end this second Banzai attack. There are no actions in the movement phase, and we move on to the advancing fire phase, where the Japanese units will be able to shoot on the American units. In H3 the two Japanese units will fire a shot of 4 firepower halved for being advancing fire phase, crippled by the shot originating in the same hex, with 6 firepower, +2 modifiers for dense jungle. Before the shot, let's clean up the board a little by removing the residual fire and defensive fire markers. 10 plus 2 equals 12, which is a miss. Hex H4 firing 12 firepower from the machine guns plus 2 through the jungle. Six plus 2 equals 8, which is 1 morale check. Eight plus 1 equal 9, which would be a breach of American morale, which Jim does not consider. H5, 8 firepower plus 2 for jungle. 2 plus 2 equals 4, which is 1 morale check. The first squadron breaks with the result of 8 plus 2. With the same result, the second squad also breaks, which will give a big advantage for the enemy on close combat. The next attack will be on I-8 with 6 firepower plus 2 for jungle, which is a miss. The Japanese units in G6 could fire on the hexes where the opposing forces exist without hitting the friendly units, as these units are not yet in close combat, but Jim does not use this resource. Rout phase. F3 to D5. Advance phase. Units in G6 can advance over the adjacent hex, but do not, preferring to advance to G5. The Japanese leader from F7 to G7. The units under the concealment marker from J7 to J6. Let's move on to the long-awaited close combat phase. In this phase there will be no ambush due to Banzai. When the Japanese attack, the encounters are resolved on the line of hand-to-hand combat with the advantage of -1 for the Japanese. This advantage will be nullified when the other American unit is Raider. Units with broken morale cannot attack and have a -2 modifier on the enemy's dice roll. Hex I6 Americans with 8 firepower and Japanese with 4 firepower. The Americans will have the Raider bonus, leader, that will nullify the Japanese hand-to-hand advantage. The Americans will also have the leader's -2 modifier. As there is no ambush, the attack will happen simultaneously in close combat. The Japanese attack will have a ratio of 1 to 2, needing at least 6 or less to affect the Americans hand-to-hand. The American attack will be at a ratio of 2 to 1, with the leader's modifier of -2, needing at least 11 to affect the Japanese. Japanese 3. All American units will be destroyed, but they will be able to carry out an attack against the Japanese. Japanese units are also eliminated in this hex. Hex H5 Japanese attack with 7 firepower against 10 firepower from the Americans, who will not be able to attack because they have broken morale. The Japanese attack will be at a ratio of 1 to 2, with the modifier of 2 due to the Americans' broken morale. A result of 8 or less will be required to affect Americans. With 7, both American squads are eliminated. Hex H4, the Japanese have 4 firepower against the Americans' 5 firepower. The ratio of the Japanese attack will be 1 to 2, with the -1 modifier due to melee, neutralized by the +1 for the attack being against the American Raiders. It will take 6 or less to affect Americans. The American attack will be 1 to 1, needing at least 7 to affect the Japanese. The Japanese fail, and the Americans get the result of 7, which will cause the reduction of one of the randomly selected Japanese squadrons. The 2 to 8 medium machine gun operators are chosen and become 1 to 8, and these units go into melee. Hex H3, where there is a Japanese unit under the DN counter, which means that this unit cannot attack, only defend itself with the -2 modifier. The Americans will attack the entirety of the Japanese units at a ratio of 2 to 1, with the modifier of -1 for the Raiders and -2 for the Japanese unit with broken morale, needing 12 or less to affect the Japanese. The 2 Japanese units with 4 firepower will only attack the Paramarines unit, which will defend with 5 firepower, in a ratio of 1 to 2, with the -1 modifier for melee, needing at least 7 to affect the Americans. The first attack will be from the Japanese, who with the result of 3 on the dice, eliminate the Paramarines. The American stack attacks with 8 - 3 = 5, and the Japanese units are eliminated. With this, we end the Japanese phase of the third round, and we go to the American phase of this round. Rally phase. There is no action for the Americans, and the Japanese will try to recover squad morale along with the 10-1 leader. Japanese positioned in same hex with a leader do not suffer the deleterious effect of counter DN, receive 1 extra point of morale, and have the modifier of -1 by the Japanese leader. On a 9 on the dice, this unit regains its morale. Prep fire phase. The anti-aircraft gun fires on Japanese units at G5 with a +2 modifier due to the gun being operated by unqualified personnel. As it will use infantry firepower equivalent, IFE, the rate of fire is reduced from 3 to 2. Six plus 2 = 8, which is a normal morale check, and the cannon loses its rate of fire. Jim makes yet another mistake by not considering the +2 modifier on this shot, and the result ends up being a 1 morale check, and the first squad becomes pink. The second squad passes. The squad with the medium machine gun in these hex fires 8 firepower, with the -2 modifier for the American leader. 3 -2 equals 1 dan in the 8 firepower column, which results in the elimination of the 2 Japanese units, and the machine gun maintain the rate of fire. A shot with this machine gun is carried out on the G5 hex, where the wounded 820 leader is located. 4 firepower -2 by American leader. Six -2 equals 4, which is 1 moral check, and the machine gun loses rate of fire. The squad passes the morale check and suffers a new attack from the machine gun with the same modifiers, and again a morale check is obtained, with the machine gun finally losing its rate of fire. The leader is injured. And when we assess the severity of the injury, the result of 4 implies a serious injury. He had already been injured before, culminating in the elimination of the Japanese leader. The unit with the other medium machine gun fires at the Japanese, stacked with the leader 10-1, with 8 firepower, +2 through the jungle. 5 +2 equals 7, which is 1 morale check. Which both Japanese units pass. Movement phase, no actions. Defensive fire phase. Japanese squad on D5 fires on American stack on G3 with 2 firepower, +2 for jungle, -1 for Japanese leader. And it's a miss. Advancing fire phase with no actions. Rout phase, no actions. Advance phase. And at this stage, in a controversial move, the Americans advance their only leader to the H3 hex. Close combat phase, and let's settle the issue of melee units. The Americans attack with 5 firepower to 3 Japanese firepower in a ratio of 3:2, with radar modifier -1, needing 9 or less to affect the Japanese. The Japanese will attack 1 to 2 with a -1 for hand-to-hand and +1 for attacking the Americans with the Raider skill, requiring a result of 6 or less to affect the Americans. And against all odds, the Japanese eliminate the American squad, ending this third round, and we are off to the rally phase of the fourth round Japanese phase. With that, let's close this episode, where despite suffering intense casualties, the Japanese still advance with good chances of a victory. The move of the sole American leader to the front will likely be regarded as a major tactical error that could result in the Americans' defeat. Hope to see you soon. Namaste.